Hello, everybody. Welcome to Lecture 3 of Environmental Science 1401. And this is going to be a rather complex chapter. So I hope you don't think I'm rushing through it. That was supposed to be a joke. But what we'll do is this chapter addresses the what is science and the nature of science, what we call the limitations of science, and this evil thing that works into the life of the sciences called pseudoscience, because particularly in environmental sciences, we run into a lot of that. So without good science, any decision made on environmental science does not work. And we've seen this throughout history. Before we had the Environmental Protection Agency in the 60s and 70s, and then we even see it today with just some, hypothetical science, pseudoscience that kind of distorts our thinking, and also just bad interpretation of data. I know we saw another aspect of this in Russian agriculture during a period called the Green Revolution, where literally the whole world was in this crisis of trying to grow food for themselves. And a fellow named Lysenko, a Russian researcher, basically fabricated a lot of his data, and it just destroyed Russian agriculture. And the same is also true for a lot of their environmental policy. After we cover scientific method, we can get a brief lesson on the structure of matter and principles of energy, because this, when we start looking at the universe, all of the universe is made up of matter and energy. And we're going to see matter is the raw material that makes us up, and energy is what gives the matter its job. And this is the whole, understanding this gives us a better understanding of how environmental systems work. So to go on, science has a kind of interesting history. It started out basically with, philosophy of interpreting life. And early science was a mixture of rational thought mixed in with mystical thought, but it was basically a way to solve problems, and it was one way to solve problems. Today we look at science as a very high-tech arena, very objective, uses a lot of instrumentation, requires a lot of specialty, to the point where I can even read a scientific journal outside of my discipline and understand it. So sometimes don't feel bad if I'm giving you a reading from a scientific article and it seems totally unintelligible. I probably won't do that, but it's always nice to see sometimes the original research. So when we look at the nature of science, and just like it says here, science is a process used to solve problems. And it's a systematic process. I mean, we have lots of ways of solving problems, but we're going to see there's a lot of limitations of the problems that we can resolve with science. We use something called a scientific method as a way of gaining this information. And guys, a scientific method is not a series of steps, even though I kind of show that in the illustration here. It's a way that we think, and it's a way that scientists think about looking at what's called cause and effects explanations of how things work. And we're going to learn a little about what's called correlation. And that's a great way to gather information too, but it's not scientific method. So when we look at the assumptions of science, and I'm going to give you a couple of more. Science works for only what we call observed events, and it looks for specific causes. And usually the way science works, and this is really frustrating when you are a scientist, particularly in environmental sciences, is we look for one cause explaining one event. And this has to do with concepts of how we work with variables, particularly in what's called a controlled experiment. And what is a variable? It's anything that we can measure and detect, and is rational in how we measure and detect it. I mean, we could use instrumentation to go beyond our senses, but usually in science we're kind of stuck with our senses. But cause and effect specifically means that I can show with about 95 to 98% accuracy and consistency that what I'm explaining here, the outcome is due to this particular cause. And in environmental science, that's difficult, because when we start learning about biomes, that means large environments, we're going to wonder where the vegetation came to make that biome. We're going to learn that biomes are defined by vegetation. and a fellow named Robert Whitaker, who I actually had as a professor once many years ago. He developed a scheme that had two variables that determined an environment. An environment meaning what we observe. Why is that environment there? And the incoming variables, which we're going to later call the independent variables, they are what explains the environment. So he found out that biomes were due to the presence of rainfall in a certain amount and an average temperature range. And those two became a prevailing factor. But later on, what we discovered by finding his model didn't work that well is that other variables, it means other causes, could affect the biome too. And that includes altitude and direction of slope on a soil or on a terrain, and also soil type. So science is a constantly learning thing. We make specific causes that exist for an event, but we're also willing to modify it, but not lie about it, but actually find good data behind it and actually do experimental method on it. So again, we have to be able to identify the causes, and that means the cause has to be measurable and detectable using rational and universally acceptable measures. So that means science throughout the world, that means in governmental science, uses standard measures, standard ways of detecting things, and whether that's the reality of the universe or not, that's still what we have to use to understand our world. Okay. We also try to keep science simple. This is called Occam's razor. Don't worry about spelling that. We try to simplify things on how nature works. And we're going to see that, particularly in environmental science, that could be good, but that could also only offer a partial explanation of nature. So we make general rules that we will eventually, hopefully, turn into things we call theories. That means actual principles that are tested over time that show how nature works. And what I mean by nature, that means the whole universe, basically. One thing assumption of science, too, is that when we do make a general rule, is that general rule repeats itself over and over. If we don't see that happen, then this is where we have to change our general rule. And it doesn't mean we fake it, we lie about it, or we change the facts. What we do is we say this general rule works under these conditions, and then we make another general rule for if this is present, blah, blah, blah. So it's kind of neat. Science is adaptable, but we tend to work with the general principles and sometimes what we call the paradigms of what we work with. Okay, what we have to assume too, guys, is in the scientific world, we have to use perceptions that are not individualistic. So that means if I'm measuring color, my gosh, I can show you color charts and I have a color aberration. I have trouble seeing shades that have anything to do with the color red and blue. So I can see those colors, but if I look at purple, I don't really know if it's light blue or is it purple. And I take a lot of lucky guesses, and sometimes I take some unlucky guesses. But color could be measured in physics as wavelength. And this is how it's even measured in environmental science. And we see that it's not really the color of a light that affects nature, is the wavelength, is the physical properties and how those physical properties affects the chemistry of us. Another thing too is that this concept of universality, is that every one of our explanations, it means has to be universal, and they also have to explain almost every situation like that. And this is a difficult thing, and we have to have about a 95 to 98% assuredness. And I know in some researchers, we go to 99 point whatever to try to get assurance that our explanation is good. And believe me, over time, people test it. We look for universality. Whenever I'm reviewing scientific papers for somebody, we call this peer review. That means when a study is done, before it's published, other people look at it. We look for these elements, and particularly the aspect of universality. Is this scientist looking at something that's a general principle that makes sense, and are they collecting data that's realistic? Now, in science, we try to bust our tush to come up with what we call cause and effect relationships. Cause and effect means I know exactly what's causing something to occur, and I can explain it in terms of what we call mechanism. That means it works like a machine. So we're going to look at nature as if it's a machine made of parts, and it's subject to the principles of chemistry and physics. And this is how environmental science works. This is at least how the scientist parts work. You know, there are people called aestheticists and others that look more at emotional or affective values of nature. I can't add a scientific benefit to the beauty of nature, but I can tell you the reason why we have to preserve certain species or maintain a biome or not pollute. I can give you cause and effect data on that. So these two graphs here, they're kind of for fun, but they show what we call a correlation. Now, correlations are important because this is what we see in everyday life. This is part of our natural observation of how things occur. So with a correlation, what we find is that if we look at two things that appear together or seem to be together, we could run a correlation on it. And that means what I could do, for example, number of Facebook users versus the rise in the stock market in the Greek government, the rise of their bonds, I could actually find a pattern. And I can see that the more Facebook users there are, as that goes up, you might find a correlation with the Greek government investment bonds. So this is a correlation, and yes, that is wonderful. We see this in global climate change research. We see increases in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and increases in temperature. And we see as CO2 decreases, so does the temperature of the Earth globally, a couple of degrees. We see increases in methane. The problem with global climate change is many variables that go into it. So we can see these correlations, but are the correlations actual? That means, is one causing the other? Because maybe global climate change can cause elevation of these atmospheric gases. So guys, do we really believe that the number of people to get on Facebook determine the stock market in Greece? Or is it that the stock market in Greece can cause the number of Facebook users to get online and get active? Or could these be two incidents by sheer chance tend to correlate? And a lot of times that's all that happens. And the same is true here. We can look at average global temperature, okay, and we can look at the cost of funding that the National Science Foundation puts into research. Now, this is a little tricky because why would amount of research being done increase global climate change? Well, maybe more scientists are studying it and we're learning it better, or could global climate change cause more research to be funded? And that might be true too. So this could be a correlation or a cause and effect. And these are two kind of very interesting samples. So what are the elements of the scientific method? And to be honest, I hate this chart because when I'm a practicing scientist, I really don't do this. I follow this incredibly complex, ugly model I'm not going to show you, which is now accepted by the scientific community, but it's a mere jumble. Because I'm sure most of you don't get up in the morning and you wake up naive and go, wow, I'm in bed. And your whole day is testing everything you're doing and literally talking yourself through it. But typically the way we simplify what the scientific method is this whole idea of making an observation. And for me, that might be, let's say I see one tree dying in a field of trees, and it's the only tree dying. That is now an observation. And to be honest, when I see that already going into my mind, they are not separate. I get a question in my head that we call a hypothesis. Now, a hypothesis, guys, is not a guess. And it is not really a question. You sometimes have to word it as a question according to what you learn in school. That's not true. A hypothesis is your best estimate of the cause and effect of that observation. And that's how I see the world. Literally with everything, including family and, when I'm driving, whatever. Look at those crazy drivers. I'm trying to find what caused them to be that way or whatever. So seriously, so this comes together in my head. Now, the hypothesis, again, is a best estimate based on your experience. Don't ever ask me to make a hypothesis outside my discipline. I am very specially trained to make hypotheses about environmental contamination, about water quality, about things that cause death in organisms. That's my area. I really don't have the expertise to confirm global climate change. I have colleagues that do, so be careful when you hear scientists that are not credentialed in that field, because they don't have the background to even make a hypothesis. They can make a guess, but that's just as good as your or my guess. And this is what bothers me when I watch the news and listen to so-called experts talking about science, as they might not be in their field. And they're just the one that wants to talk. Because most of us scientists, we're careful about making hypotheses. We're really cautious, and we don't do it until we have all the facts. Now, once a scientist does make a hypothesis, you don't just make it. What you have to do is find some experimental methods, either through mathematics, controlled experiments, through what's called modeling, or just observation in general, to see that it's true, because you can narrow your observation. I've had friends that studied lakes, and you can't do an experiment on a lake for the research what they were doing. So what they did was they basically took a giant bag, submerged it in the lake, and studied that little piece of the lake and measured all the variables in that as things were going on, and they controlled that situation. It's really kind of neat. So when we look at testing, there's something called a study, and a study is usually a correlation. That means a study is I looked into this and I found this correlation. You see this a lot in nutritional research, where people that eat potato chips, tend to get heart attacks, and those that don't, well, you don't know if it's the potato chips that does that. It just correlates. So you don't know if the potato chips are the cause. There's too many things going on, and it might not even be the potato chips. It might be that people with heart attacks even tend to eat potato chips, and actually that's what the literature shows, is that people who are prone to heart attacks tend to like fatty foods. Isn't that nice? So, but with that knowledge, we can control it. So when we test a hypothesis, what we do is we carry this thing out called a controlled experiment if we can. Okay, and then we draw conclusions from that experiment. And guys, what we don't show proof. We show that I am false or not false. That means for now, I am not false. We don't show truth because we don't know it absolutely. And if we don't show truth, we don't show not false. It means my hypothesis is false. You revise your hypothesis, and you revise it in a rational way, not guessing. You say, well, I think I missed this. Let me rethink it. And what you do, and this is what I do, is because I'm not the brightest person out there in my field, I'll ask others. So I did this, and it doesn't seem to work. And this is how we work in science. Communication is important. We call it peer communication, P-E-E-R. So once we draw conclusions, we can show again that my idea fits with current laws and theories, or I have a real stinker. Okay, so or I can come up with what we call a scientific theory or law. So some data confirms what's out there. Some data is new, but it still has to fit within the paradigm of what science is, because some data does negate and show a little falseness in current ways of looking at things. So science is a growing endeavor. We never assume our tested hypotheses, which if they're good enough become theories, are always going to last. We always learn that something out there we might have missed, or there might be conditions, particularly environmental science, that can create issues and create different outcomes. So I discussed earlier what an observation is. And basically, in scientific observations, we have to be thoughtful and careful. The observation has to be rational, measurable. It has to be in a form we can collect data and stuff like that. And it has to be universally acceptable. That means my observation has to meet what other people would see out of that situation. It doesn't mean we have to have the same explanation. And again, we can't base it on metaphysics. So what is metaphysics? Metaphysics is emotion. Metaphysics is spirits. It's like, can the mind control something? And literally, it also has to do with God. In science, we're not there to measure God. We're there to measure physical features of the universe that we can manipulate and deal with and better understand. So it's not that we don't work God into science. It's just not what we test. Okay, so please keep this in mind, that we can't test metaphysical things. I don't have a phone to ask God, why is this doing this? And a lot of that is frustrating for us because we have to work with only a certain component of nature. Now, some researchers do deal with emotion. They look at measurable emotions. That means, is this person showing high levels of stress? Is this person show high levels of serotonin as a result of a certain environmental change? That can be done. But we can measure what's called good and bad. That means, is an outcome good or bad? But guys, we can't measure right and wrong. That is metaphysical. We can't measure ethical outcomes. Good and bad is not an ethical outcome. It's an absolute of whether something's good for the environment or not. Right and wrong means, should I have done it? Based on a moral system for either me or somebody else or society. And a lot of us do science for mere exploration. I was not that type. My science was called applied. That means I looked for knowledge that had usefulness, or somebody came up with a problem and I solved it for them by doing scientific method. So, the elements of scientific method, we talked about the hypothesis, and please read your book on this and look at the PowerPoints. I kind of went through that already, but a hypothesis is not a guess. And usually it's made by people that are very experienced in that area of science. The experiment itself, again, has to directly test a hypothesis. That means you have to test your question. You have to see if what you said is a cause and effect is there. So in an experiment, what we do is we try to recreate that situation in a lab or in nature. And we try to compare it to other things. We try to compare it to what's called the null, or what's called the controlled. So if I believe a tree I see in the forest is dying because there's worms in it, I can look for the worms, but so what? Are the worms that control the thing that's killing the tree? So what I can do is take that tree, plant it, and give it worms. Let's just say nematodes to be accurate, that attack the roots. So let's say I find out that those nematodes attack the roots is the only thing I changed about that tree, and it dies. Well, I still don't know the nematodes did it. It could have just died. So I'd have to have a separate situation where I have that tree with no nematodes and see if it dies. And it has to be exactly the same conditions. And to even be safe, I'd have to do it over and over again, or try 10 control trees, and maybe even 10 trees infected with worms. So this is what we mean by control. It means, do I have control over my explanation of the cause of something, which means the independent variable, versus the effect, that means what my cause is doing to something, which we call the dependent variable. And again, I mentioned reproducibility. Scientists reproduce their own studies over and over again. I remember this from graduate school. And also, if I see a study that I'm interested in, I might redo it and then expand from there, or I might use it as the basis of another experiment. And if it doesn't work, that first experiment, I question it. Well, first I question myself. And when I question it, I talk to the researcher. And we work out to see, was that experiment done properly, or am I just doing my own experiment wrong? So, the take-home points of this are observation, particularly in environmental science, experimental method is very important. We have to look at the right things to observe, the right variables, and set them up in the right conditions to do a good experiment. Those observations, again, have to be very strict within guidelines, okay, of what is the material world, what is the metaphysical world. And plus, communication. Science is not done in a vacuum. We publish in many journals. We produce YouTubes now. We have blogs. We go to meetings. There'll be times I'm going away to a meeting and I won't be able to check my email a lot of times. So communication is the key. So that means, and what happens when we communicate, we share our ideas and other scientists can critique it. And that's the problem I have when we have people that work alone. They say every scientist hates me, they're all against me, and they're refuting my research, probably because their research sucks, to be honest with you. And I've seen this with many things, particularly related to pseudoscience. So what are my limitations as an environmental science? Is I'd love to address moral and ethical situations. I'd really like to say that we have to preserve this rainforest. But I've seen over and over that sometimes when we damage a rainforest, guys, nature recovers. You've learned from your first habitable planet that the Earth changes and destroys everything over. Most of the creatures on the Earth have been destroyed 3 times. 99% of the creatures have been killed off 3 times in the history of the Earth. And we're probably looking at another one eventually. Probably not in our lifetime, but we're going to be part of it. So why preserve nature? Why preserve a status quo? These are difficult things for me, but I know I can show that it might have this impact. We're going to learn about something called biome services, and it means how does an environment help me, or ecosystem services? How does my ecosystem help me? And I'm going to see that you have to be very scientific about approaching that to show that it really has a value that keeps you alive today or in the near future. So again, we require validity too. As far as a limitation, that means we have to, our data has to be processed right, interpreted properly, and rationally. And now there's this thing called pseudoscience, which pseudo means fake. Pseudoscience comes in 2 forms, but all of it involves convincing, confusing, misleading people, and using scientific terms to come up with fraud. And sometimes, guys, people do stuff they don't know they're doing fraudulent stuff. Fellow named Lysenko, I mentioned, that's why I'm wearing the hat. He wanted to impress the Soviet government by showing that if you raise crops under what's called socialist ideology, survival of the fittest, this type of stuff, which is a perversion of Darwinianism, because they believed communism was this climb towards human betterment, evolution towards a better government. So they literally, he did all of his plant research based on that and came up with bad data that he didn't report to the government. And eventually he bred, tons and tons of crops that got planted and had major failures of crops that literally caused a famine that killed tens of thousands of people, starved to death, okay, because of his stuff, because of what he did. And it took them years to recover from that. Another fraud you see is something like, and this is important environmental science, alternative fuels, and things like cold fusion and perpetual energy. Guys, none of these match the principles of science. Now, fusion is a real thing, particularly what we call cold fusion. It means, can I make a nuclear reactor that runs cold? And can I take a cold system that produce so much heat I can fuel the earth and not pollute anymore? All I got to do is get a hold of these 2 simple metals. It's a very simple process. But after reviewing this for a long time, I actually wrote a module on this for a university. Actually, for a university, they were contracted to a book company to build these modules. We looked at all these fraudulent practices, and a lot of them were not meant to deceive. It was people that were just not paying attention to their data or ignoring things. And in a lot of cases, it was fraud, particularly a couple of cold fusion people that were selling their stuff, and it didn't work. So be careful of pseudoscience. You find a lot of them, unfortunately, being heralded by politicians and being cited. And we find a lot of them giving talks, and a lot of them developing things that sound rational. So pseudoscience, it's a way to mislead. And also pseudoscience is done sometimes by misleading hypotheses that have never been tested or been tested improperly. So please be aware of that. And I will point out along the way pseudosciences. Now, back to the real stuff. So what is science study? Science studies 2 things. We try to interpret the behavior of matter and the behavior of energy. I hate to reduce you to that, guys, but we're all just like our cars. We're made up of parts. These parts eventually can be reduced to these things we call matter, which is composed of atoms, and specific atoms are called elements. And we can be found in 4 types of forms of matter: solid, liquid, gas, and plasma. Most of our body kind of fits in between these 2, that we sometimes call a colloid, okay, which means you're kind of soft and squishy, but you're not quite solid, but you're not quite liquid. So whatever. Plasma is more like we find in the sun. So very weird, very hot gases that don't obey the principles we see on Earth normally. So we're going to see that energy is what gets matter to take on these states of matter. And we can see is that energy increases. This is just a general principle, is that something that is solid under certain energy conditions doesn't just mean heat. It can mean pressure, other things, can become liquid, and in some cases semi-liquid. And liquids can become gas. You can actually have solids immediately become gas. This is called sublimation. This has a lot to do with atmospheric pressure, vacuums. And then we have this condition called plasma, which is a very unusual situation, very high energy situation that gives us all life on Earth, which means things like stars and suns, which a sun is just a star. So this is very important because, guys, organisms harvest matter. You eat matter to obtain energy, to run your body, to keep you in the state that you're in, and also matter as a raw material to build your parts. Because you're constantly replacing parts, you're constantly building cells. I'm not going to beat this dead. For the test, understand what an atom is. And I'm going to do this slowly and horribly as usual. And I'm going to buy a touchpad, I promise. I'll get a touchpad so I can at least write a little neater somewhat with a pen. So matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. And if you take physics, they're going to debate this because they have this stuff called dark matter, which sounds like, you know, Darth Vader versus Luke, who's the white, you know, the real matter, whatever, you know. So, but in environmental science, we try to explain how matter makes a creature, how matter becomes a pollutant in some creatures and not in others. Being me, an environmental physiologist, toxicologist, I would study why does one chemical kill an organism and the other doesn't. And I'd have to come up with a cause and effect or mechanistic explanation. And a lot of this course requires chemistry. Now, we have something called the kinetic model theory. That means matter means nothing until you apply energy to it. So you can go deep into outer space, and you will find very little matter, very little energy, nothing going on. And it's a really weird, interesting world of who knows what is out there. And I'm not going to even hypothesize on that. So we do know matter, okay, it's all made up of what we call subatomic parts. And yes, these are important in environmental science. You do need to know that there's these things called protons and neutrons and electrons. And what's important to you is they give each matter, type of matter or element, their properties that we use in nature. So we're going to find that our atoms are very simple, made up of very few protons, which we call a low atomic number, or they can be very complex, which means they have a very large amount of protons or a very high atomic number. Protons give an atom its properties. And think about this. Just like, you know, the composition of a food gives us its properties. The complexity of a food, that is true also of matter. Neutrons give stability. Guys, matter is not permanent. Matter can come apart. It can decay either very slowly, which can take millions of years, or it can decay rapidly, or it can give off energy with decays in an explosive force called radioactive energy. Atoms can vary in the number of neutrons. Usually the number of protons are constant. Has to be. That means if you have 8 protons, you're this. If you have 9 protons, you're that. But neutrons can vary within an atom, because you usually learn that there's 8 neutrons, 8 protons. You could have 7, 6, you could have up to 10. But the more you get away from an equal number, the more unstable that atom gets. And living creatures don't like unstable atoms, because we call those unstable atoms isotopes, because they could be deadly to us. That's an oh, this is horrible. I love it. Isotope. Okay, I promise I'll get a touchpad for the next video. So what are these things called isotopes? So we talked about atoms. In our Earth, we find 92 common types. We have who knows how many. We're getting up to 120 now that we can manufacture in the lab, or we find in weird places of the universe. But our Earth has access to 92 types of atoms. You know, it's funny, living creatures only make use of about 6 for about 99.9% of your body. So we are very unimaginative as far as organisms. Rocks use many more atoms to make up their structure. So just appreciate that of all the types of atoms out there, some of which are not found on our Earth very commonly, if at all, is that we are made up of very few, and that's what makes the Earth unique. We have about 6 atoms that if we don't have in abundance, life does not exist, or it exists in very low populations. And we're going to pay attention to this when we look at what's called cycling. So guys, read up on this. Understand what an isotope is, because I don't want to go into too much detail in it till we get into the aspects of environmental science and acquire that knowledge. So, for example, now we're going to talk about isotopes when we talk about nuclear power. When we talk about what creatures do when they eat, we're going to talk about now the nature of the atoms that they eat. So understand, know the jargon right now. We're going to come back to it. Now, we are not really made of elements. We are composed of elements, but elements can be put together into larger structures we call molecules or compounds. And those things are held together by bonds. So what we see in nature is nature has a capacity for 2 major categories of bonds, even though there is an in-between area. And that's going to be an important area we're going to study later when we looked at the impacts of pollutants on us. So there's one type of bond called ionic, and that means it's found in certain types of atoms, and I'll show you those on the periodic table, that are electrically attracted to each other. Okay, this is like standing next to somebody that you're interested in. And the only reason why you're hanging around them is because you have kind of like a mutual interest. In this case, it's opposite charges. So sodium only hangs out with chloride because, you know, wow, we're attached, we're bros. Okay. But what happens is the attachment, something else interferes with it. Like something that sodium likes better. Or you mix water in there and water intervenes and breaks these 2 apart literally. You lose that bond. So ionic bonds tend to be solid. They tend to be crystals, we'll learn, and we find them in like salt, and they tend to a lot of times dissolve and crack. This is not true of the bonds that make us up, except maybe this is partially what our bone is, because it actually is held together with ionic bond structures supported by, we're going to see, covalent bonds. But elements that form covalent bonds produce most of what you see in your body. I call it the soft, squishy stuff. So these produce plastic. A lot of stuff around us is covalent bonds. This is when the atoms are directly attached to each other. I mean, they are so close, they're sharing parts. They share electrons, and they're hard to pull apart. These can be difficult to pull apart, but you can crack them. You can break them. And even simple things can break them. But this takes effort, a lot of effort. And we learn this real quickly when we try to digest food. We have to break covalent bonds takes a lot of effort, a lot of extreme conditions that you find actually in your stomach, which is really kind of neat. So covalent bonds are what we call the bonds of life. Now, when we start looking at molecules are going to have very important properties in environmental science. We have to know how that molecule interacts in the environment to understand what it does. So there's a principle called polarity. There's a term called nonpolar, which in general means that this molecule, or this atom, or element in this case, has no electrical charge on it. It's neutral in electrical charge. Okay, this is a substance that does not dissolve well in water. It does dissolve well in things called oils. And we're going to see that when these things are released in the environment, they cannot be transported through water unless something helps them. Nonpolar substances stick to soil. They will stick to minerals sometimes, which is why when we're dealing with nonpolar pollutants, it's not a problem until, let's say, there's sediment or soil in the water, or something for them to stick to, or let's say an oil slick, oil contamination. They will travel with it. Now, when something that's polar, it either has an individual negative charge, like positive or negative, or it has partial charges on it. That means it has, like water, has a slight negative charge here and a slight positive charge, actually 2 of them here. And that adds to their uniqueness because they have both charges. Polar molecules tend to dissolve in water because water itself is attracted to these molecules and it holds them in place. So we're going to get back to this idea of polarity. And the books sometimes use terms called hydrophobic, which means fear of water. That's the same term as nonpolar, hydrophobic. And then there's a term hydrophilic, which is the same as being polar. Hydrophilic means to love water. Another term, which is not in your book, references a concept called mirror images or alternate shapes or chirality. It means when nature builds a molecule, certain molecules can have alternate forms based on their structure. So for example, this is called an acid group. This is a bunch of elements stuck to this carbon, stuck to this thing called an R group. Don't worry, it is. This is complex. This is called an ammonia group, and there's a hydrogen. So think about taking a ball and just sticking thumbtacks in it, or pins, or pens. You have a styrofoam ball. You can stick the same types of pens in two different balls in the same position, in different positions, or in what's called a mirror image. And we call this chirality. Guys, as nature builds molecules and encounters molecules, because you are a creature that eats molecules, your body is set up for molecules based on their shape. And sometimes in nature, we can find that a shape can be wrong for a molecule and can cause harm. So we know there are these things called amino acids in your diet, which this is. You have to eat. And if we need to be eating what's called the left form, that's what you need. It helps your body. If you eat what's called the right form, that means right like left or right, or what's called the wrong chiral form, that can have an unexplained or sometimes damaging effect on the body. So these are two terms we're going to come back to. So it's called polarity and chirality. And guys, temperature of a molecule can alter its chirality sometimes. And we're going to learn that temperature range is a very important condition for organisms. So these properties can vary somewhat depending on the molecule based on environmental conditions. Another concept you have to be aware of is this concept called inorganic versus organic. So anything that is inorganic, and this is a difficult definition, usually does not contain a lot of carbon, and if it does, the carbon sits attached to other what we call non-organic elements. We'll talk about this. This is why I mean this is difficult. But just look at your definition here. So usually what happens when something is inorganic is usually composed of what are called ionic or metallic bonds. Okay, these are two important bonds that make up the mineral world, the earth. Organic molecules contain a group of six common elements: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, phosphorus, and sulfur, covalently bonded together into unique structures we call organic. Organic chemicals just means that organisms can use this to build their bodies, but not all of them. Inorganic matter is usually the matter of minerals, rocks. But guys, your bone, the skeleton, external skeletons of certain creatures, and certain hardening tissues in trees use inorganic material, but they blend it into their structure and they use it for an inorganic purpose. That means sort of like you holding on to a stick and using it to help you get along. The stick is not really part of you, but you're using it for its chemical properties and physical properties of what it can do, but it's separate from you. So when we compare inorganic to organic, we can see that they both can contain the same stuff. But look right here at this. What we're going to learn is that something called silicon, and carbon are the backbones of how molecules are made in nature. Carbon is the backbone of organic matter. That means this is the stuff we glue other things to. This is the atom we attach oxygen, hydrogen, all these things through and make living molecules. And guys, living molecules give you the properties of life. That's what's amazing about this. The inorganic world is very heavy in aluminum and silicon, and if you take geology, a lot of iron, a lot of calcium sometimes. So when you build a structure out of this, usually it has ionic bond properties, or what we call metallic bond properties, or crystal bond properties, totally unlike your own properties, but more like bone, which is partially crystal, partially organic. It's a mixture of the two. At least our bones are, and that's not true in certain creatures whose bones are made of silicon, which is actually glass. And it's also true of clams, what we call malas. They use a lot more inorganic material than we do in our structure, and actually use it almost in a mineral form. So this is a major distinction. So we look at this living world and this inanimate world, of which this relies on this in many occasions. So, my friend, the periodic table. Again, how do we, what do scientists do with this thing? How do we understand it? Why am I making it look at you? We're going to see that nature, organic things, uses a lot of these. And the F is supposed to be left out. So this point of the periodic table, these elements have a particular group of properties that lead to what we interpret as life, at least under conditions of our planet. That's the problem, and that supposedly says life. We'll deal with it. Okay. This, and a lot of this, is part of the mineral world, going from what we sometimes call true metals to metalloids. Different properties. This is the theoretical world. Okay, these are very unstable materials that work best with radiation sciences. We're not going to worry too much about that, except when we look at nuclear energy and alternative fuels. This is a weird world of elements that don't interact much with anything, but they are an important aspect of our environment, and some of these are actually toxic to you. And we use them for particular purposes like lighting and other things. But these are the big guys we have to understand. Carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur are what provide your body structure and chemistry and work for the planet Earth. Now, guys, other planets could have other materials that make them up. So anything related to carbon, like silicon, for example, which makes up mineral, aluminum, which makes up mineral, is very close to us. And there have been hypotheses that there could be mineral-type life forms that are crystalline, semi-crystalline they have to be, but can get around and do their job. And there are other people that speculate about other elements that could be used to make living substances. It's all dependent on how life makes use of the energy in a system. As we get into this semester, actually starting probably next week, we're going to look at what does nature do. We're going to look at the concept called the ecosystem. And part of an ecosystem is how does energy transfer from nature into living things, and then living things make use of that material. So when we start looking at matter, organisms use matter not in the elemental form but the molecular form. And we're going to see all organisms on this earth and probably on other planets. There's good darn evidence of that. All of us use these things called amino acids to build proteins, and these are naturally occurring molecules. Living creatures build them, like plants and bacteria, but they're also found in nature. They actually can be formed when lightning hits water. They can be formed in the upper atmosphere. We find them on meteorites. These are naturally occurring things that we just borrow to make our body. There's fatty acids, same thing. These are used to make all types of fats, one of which are called phospholipids, which makes your cell structure. There are carbohydrates. This is a very unique one, because these two mostly serve the purpose of building a body. This has the purpose of providing energy for your body, and also, particularly if you're a plant, building your body structure. Okay, so here's the carbohydrates. Okay, which glycerol is kind of like an in-between one. I wish they didn't put that there. This is kind of an in-between one that helps to make phospholipids. Actually, all of these can be converted back and forth into each other if you had the right chemistry to do it. And then there's what are called nuclear bases or nucleotides. And this includes the stuff called DNA, RNA. Without it, creatures can't do their work, and also they can't replicate. So know these. And we're going to learn later that protein is characterized by being very prevalent in the element called nitrogen. So wherever nitrogen goes, you find proteins. Now they're also found in here, but an important element for here is going to be phosphorus. We're going to learn that of all the elements, nitrogen and phosphorus determine the amount of life on Earth. And that if we don't get enough nitrogen, you will become sick as an organism or a population will drop. Nitrogen and phosphorus together help to control the health and the amount of creatures on the Earth. And it's nothing magical about nitrogen and phosphorus. It's just that nitrogen is found in proteins, which create body structure and function, and phosphorus is found in DNA and RNA, but also in energy production for the body. So both of these elements are essential and are linked to these particular molecules. And again, as we go through the course, we're going to look at their path in nature. We're going to also learn that these are polar, so they dissolve in water, so are these and so are these, and these are nonpolar. And they create problems because they're difficult to transport in nature, in a creature's body, and even in your own blood. Now, our Earth is in what we call the Goldilocks zone. That means we have the right amount of solar energy coming to us, the right balance of wavelengths of light. We don't have too much radiation hitting us. I mean, enough we're protected from it. We have an atmosphere but in the most part today was produced by plants. Okay, we have enough mineral resources and we have enough organic substance resources. That means carbon, hydrogen, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus, oxygen, that we maintain the Earth. But the one other important thing is water. So by the presence of water, either in its solid, liquid, or gas state, in our planet we live in an aqueous or liquid water environment. I'm sure on other planets there are creatures that live in gaseous water, that live in ice, that actually function. We actually have creatures here that function in ice. They're called cryophiles, extremophiles. They love it. Okay, so water makes our planet have life. It allows our molecules to come together, to organize themselves, and to have this temperature monitoring effect that allows us to exist. It is probably one of the most important conditions in the environment and a major what we call limiting factor. That means determining the availability of life to survive. So please read your book and of course the PowerPoints about water, because it's a lot of what I told you. Water is polar, which helps our molecules to get together, to be able to carry them, okay, particularly in substances like blood, and for creatures that live in the oceans to be able to obtain nutrients and to survive in themselves. But water has a moderating effect on our planet. It helps to keep the planet from getting too hot, too cold. This, and this is why water is a very important component of greenhouse gases. Too much water can actually cause sometimes a cooling, sometimes a warming of the planet, and actually blocks heat from getting to the planet, but also holds on to heat. And that could be a problem locally and globally. Water dissolves most of the stuff that we need to be alive, including the mineral components. And I'm sure there are planets up there where they don't have water as a liquid. They have something else, and they survive probably just as well as we do. So we live in what's called an aqueous planet. And water has a lot of properties that you can read about in your book. One of the major properties being called pH, not Ph. And this is where we come up with the concept of acid, neutral, base, and sometimes base is called alkaline. I see that on my batteries all the time. This is unique to liquids and even steam. Any form of water can have pH, but many liquids of other substances could also have something equivalent to pH. pH is a measure of what we call hydrogen ions in solution. It's an electrically charged particle that is very unstable. It can bind to your chemistry. It can destroy your chemistry. It can change the shape of your chemistry. We call that denaturing. You have to live in an environment of ions, hydrogen ions, that's appropriate for your body chemistry and function. Because hydrogen ions, too much of them could act like glue that congeal your body. And if you don't have enough hydrogen ions, it can prevent your body from obtaining things, because these act sort of like little grippers sometimes in nature. So when we deal with the concept of acid, acid is anything, and don't worry about releases hydrogen ions. It has a lot of hydrogen ions in its solution. And usually when something's an acid, it's given a low pH number. I know that sounds bad. High hydrogen ions, low pH, but don't worry about it. This is actually a mathematical calculation, what's called a log function, of a tiny number of hydrogens, literally a fraction of hydrogens. So what we see is a pH of about 1 to 6 are considered acids. These are very strong acids. These are weak acids. And all strong and weak means is the power that that hydrogen ion has on the environment. So, for example, if I were to take something with a pH of 6 and spilling on you, you won't even feel it. If I take something like a pH of 4 and spilling in your eye, it will irritate your eye. If I take something with a pH of 2, it will cause your eye to burn, and it will turn it kind of like a white opaque. I just denatured the surface of your eye. If I pour something of a pH of 1 to 0 in your eye would dissolve away and turn into a liquid mess. That's the power of hydrogen. So hydrogen could be in too large amount, or in the case of a base, too little amount, too low. And bases are usually given higher numbers. Don't worry about that again. And we usually give them what's called these litmus colors. That means sometimes we represent acids as red, bases as blue, and that just has to do with a test called the litmus test that determines that. Okay, and I don't want to go too much more into that. So understand the pH scale, because we're going to talk about things like acid precipitation. We're going to see a video out of China about air pollution that has to do with what's called acid smog. The pH of that smog is almost at a 3, which means that can cause harm to body tissues. And we have children and elderly people living in this smog, a permanent smog of this acid that is killing the children, killing the elderly. It's horrible, but that's how the situation is, unfortunately. Now, when the whole idea of survival again is you're this chemical machine that is constantly breaking down. We call that property entropy. You're constantly falling apart. It has to do with the nature of our universe. Don't worry about it, and you can't stop it, so whatever. But we're constantly breaking down, which means we have to obtain new materials. Our body requires a constant source of energy to run in order to take in materials and rebuild materials. So we're going to see we spend a lot of our life breaking apart bonds and putting them back together, and taking in energy and giving off energy in our bodies. Enzymes are special proteins that carry that out for us. So we don't have to rely on the environment to do it for us. Because guys, if you're eating, you can rely on nature to break down the food into the small molecules you need to eat it. But that can take years. Even more than years. I mean, eons. So you use enzymes to increase the probability of that food breaking down, so you can get it to occur right away. It doesn't speed up nature. It actually makes nature more likely to do something, but not speed it up. And again, don't worry so much about that as much as what an enzyme is. So enzymes give you the ability to tap into nature, to collect resources and to gather energy. And we're going to see in your bodies, you carry out 2 types of chemical reactions, what are called exothermic. And these are chemical reactions that when they occur, it means you can break a bond, make a bond. They give off energy. And sometimes that energy is in the form of heat, sometimes in the form of some type of work. But when you eat a cookie, and there's the nice little glucose from a cookie, when you eat it, you break apart the bonds of that cookie. And thanks to the chemical structure of that cookie, when you break apart those bonds, it gives you energy to be able to run machinery that makes your body work its enzymes. A lot of enzymes require energy, a form called ATP, which is like a fuel for enzymes. So you have to build ATP, which requires energy. And you do that by breaking down other molecules to get that energy to do it. Then there's endothermic reactions. Guys, this is sort of like You have that dream when you have a final you never studied for, you never attended a class, and you take it, and the amount of energy you put into trying to pass that test is just not worth it. You end up with a negative grade, whatever. That's like an endothermic reaction. These suck energy in from the environment. They actually feel cold. You actually put work into it. Like if I was to ask you to go and break a piece of wood in half, you're going to expend a lot of energy into doing that. That's endothermic. That means your body is using up, taking, energy, and you're putting that energy into the system to break, a stick or something. So endothermic comes into play when we start looking at building new molecules in the body. You need energy to carry out reactions. So you need endothermic reactions to transfer energy to enzymes. So when we're building ATP, that sucks in energy. But what's kind of neat? ATP stores that energy and releases some of it back to us in the form of exothermic. So again, these are just two terms. Deal with it, and we'll come back to them later. So when we look at the chemistry of life, and this is a powerful picture. I'd love to get a tattoo of this. Okay, but I wouldn't know where to put it, obviously, and they better spell everything right when they do it. Is when we start looking at nature, what life is, what you have to understand in environmental science, it's living creatures, which are machines made up of organic, covalently bonded compounds. And for some reason, we have this necessity that is programmed in our DNA that we're going to eat other things or use energy from the environment to build our chemistry. So we're going to look at plants as builders of chemistry. We're going to cover these more next week. We're going to look at animals that steal another creature's body to use to build their own, and then we steal theirs, and who the heck knows what hunts that? Something probably very big. Maybe a wolf will hunt a bobcat. I don't know. Probably maybe even a human, whatever. So we go through the cycle of taking in materials, and then we die, we poop, we pee, and those materials go back, and they feed other creatures. So life is this incredible cycling. As we take in food from creatures, we're also taking in energy, and it takes energy to get energy. So I'm not trying to be poetic or pretty about this, but this is the chemistry of life. And everything we learned requires matter and energy to keep us going, and not just our bodies, but our whole society, everything we do. So to end with this, I don't want to get into this until we start covering energy in itself. But energy is basically something that allows molecules to do work, to give them motion, to vibrate them, to cause them to change in some way. Work, and now your book says work is done when an object is moved. That's not technically true. Work could be measured in other forms. But just know work just means it's something you need to get molecules to do their job. And we can find that energy exists in two forms, and this is fundamental to environmental science as an organism and as we use energy. So we have this term called kinetic energy. This is energy right now as it's being used, like in my hand, to make the motion of this thing. And this I consider kinetic energy. Water that is flowing and doing work. And guys, I was in Niagara Falls this summer, and I remember standing right at the edge of the fall. It was like, this is actually Hoover Dam, but I mean, we were this close to the water, and I've heard of people falling in and boats falling in, and when they do, man, that movement of the water can do work on you. It can tear apart a boat, particularly if you hit the rocks too. But it is powerful, and it actually eats away the rocks. That waterfall is constantly eating away the rocks around it. It's incredible. Digs a hole in the ground right where it forms. So kinetic energy is energy doing its work, either exothermic, endothermic work. Potential energy means that this is energy that is stored, that we store. And that means the water up here is just sitting there. It has the potential to move. Another way to think of potential energy, guys, is in your food. We measure this as calories. So your food has a certain amount of potential energy called the calorie content. And if you eat that cookie, that could be used for kinetic energy in your body. And if you don't need that much kinetic energy to run your body, some of the cookie is stored as fat. which is potential energy in your body. So guys, when you have fat reserves in your body, that's just a source of potential energy to keep you alive when you can't obtain food. And that's one way to think about body fat in a way. Creatures, that's how they think about it. It's very important for them. Another thing we have to pay attention to in nature is these things called the laws of thermodynamics. Thermodynamics just means movement based on vibrational energy or heat. Believe it or not, everything occurs because we have a certain temperature that causes the vibrations we need. As you get closer to being in outer space, those vibrational temperatures go down, and our molecules can't do their job because there's not enough energy to have them do it. And sometimes they can get so hot that the molecules can't do their job, they even fall apart and decay, and that's a problem. So the laws of thermodynamics means that we live in a temperature range, okay, that allows our body to follow these two major principles. There's several principles. And what you have to understand, because people that carry out pseudoscience don't, energy cannot be created from nothingness and cannot be turned into nothingness. You can turn energy into matter. When these laws came out, we didn't know that. Thanks to Einstein, we now know it. So, yes, you can make matter from energy, and energy from matter. But it's a very difficult process, very unstable process. And one day it will be our future, probably, of energy sources. Fusion, whatever, fusion and fission. Fission we already use. Okay. Also, when we convert energy from one form to another, some of it's going to be given off as waste. And I'm going to show that in this image of this little dumb car, smart car, or whatever you want to call it. Okay, this car requires fuel. Fuel is potential energy. Until you put a match to it or ignite it or put it under pressure like diesel, then it explodes. That's kinetic energy. And that makes basically the engine in here, usually an Ottoman engine, move some pistons and eventually turns these wheels to make the car go. Okay, this could also have a battery in it that produces a flow or charge that makes a motor that's attached to these wheels spin. It all depends. But guys, when energy is put in, some energy is lost into the machine. That means friction in the machine running. So guys, when you eat a 200-calorie cookie, your body is lucky to see a small percentage of that. Much of it goes into the process of getting the cookie, eating the cookie, digesting the cookie, and then eventually storing the cookie away. We're going to see that in your body, you probably use, maybe a quarter to a half, if you're active, of the calories that are in your food. In nature, we're going to see that organisms literally only extract an average of 10% of the calories they get out of their foods because of their lifestyle and other things related to them, their body size, other things. We're going to learn that later. Okay, so again, I mentioned that the calorie is the unit of looking at energy. And guys, in environmental science, we're constantly measuring calories. We use it as a way to determine how much food is available in nature, how much resource. So we can look at this from two perspectives. We can look at the calories of energy sources available to you to heat a home or to run society. We can look at the calorie of papers by looking at the calories of trees and how much paper they can provide. We can look at the calories of wood pellets for burning, charcoal, whatever. We're very interested in how much petroleum is available, because petroleum is also in calories that give off heat when we burn it for whatever process. So in nature, we can look at the calories of squirrels, and he's kind of a little panicky about that, that will support their predators. In humans, guys, we look at the calories of the total crops, what's called the biomass we can produce, and that darn better match nature. So we're going to get back into this whole thing later of energy cycling. So please, if you have any questions, send me an email or leave me a voicemail, and I'm going to be posting some other materials for you to look at. Thank you, and bye.